which, as a 27-year-old woman, Austen is working with a character whose sort of moral education has already occurred, right? She doesn't need to undergo the kind of change in character, especially an ethical character, that we have with someone like Lizzie or Emma Woodhouse. But that then makes it, a harder sort of novel to write in one sense, because how are you going to take your reader through, right? So in Pride and Prejudice and Emma, you can take your reader through by showing the mistakes that the protagonist makes and how they respond to the recognition of those mistakes and the correction and so on, right? Well, we don't have that with Anne. She's really somewhere else. She's on the other side. And instead, I think what we get is Austen sort of exploring what it means to be Anne Elliot in this position and in a family where her word had no weight, right? In a situation in which her beloved comes back, right? And she's still in love, but she feels she doesn't have the right to say, all right, let's start over. He's resentful, all this kind of stuff. And so it seems to me that Austen is doing something different with the marriage plot and with the kind of serious comedy that she's writing. And just one last thing here, right? One of the striking things about Pride and Prejudice is that Austen kind of gives her audience assurances that things are going to work out, right? And so by the time we get to that first proposal, right, we know it's a temporary obstacle to the eventual happiness of Lizzie, right? So, like, for example, in the first chapter, right, we get this dialogue between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, and he's kind of saying, oh, she says, oh, a single man of large fortune moved into the neighborhood, right? Oh, you got to go visit him. And he's like, oh, why should I do that? And he's teasing her, and he's like, he's not going to do it as far as we know, right? But then in the first paragraph of the second chapter, we find out that Mr. Bennet was among the first to call upon Mr. Bingley, right? And other things, like, so Lizzie gets threatened with a proposal from Collins, right? Her happiness is threatened with a proposal from Mr. Collins, and her father comes to the rescue, and she doesn't have to accept the proposal, and all this kind of stuff. The beginning of Persuasion, it doesn't work that way, right? We get introduced to Sir Walter and Elizabeth, right? And Anne is situated in relationship to them as the outsider, right? They're put in this situation of, okay, they have to retrench, right? And they have to move out of Kellynch Hall and all this stuff. And at every step along the way, Anne makes a suggestion about what they should do, right? About how they should retrench, right? And even where they should go. Let's stay in the country here, a more modest house, right? We could still be close to Mary. I could still be close to Lady Russell. All this stuff. It's all rejected, right? So we don't have the kind of pattern of assurance that we get, right? Although I think what happens in Persuasion is that when Louisa jumps from the cob and hits her head, there's a sort of shift in the narrative, right? And this opens up, I think, kind of expectations for Anne and so on, which is really kind of interesting. And then there's more to say about the problem with, the narrative challenge. That's what I mean. The narrative challenge of, how do I tell this story when my protagonist doesn't really need to change? But I'll stop there and turn it over to Susan.
Well, thanks, Jim. Again, lovely to be here with you all and to be talking with you. And Lindsay, thank you for moderating today. Like Jim, my history with Austen goes back, mine goes back to some English class in high school, some college prep English class in high school, when Pride and Prejudice and Northanger Abbey were both on the reading list. So in high school, I read Austen, thought Pride and Prejudice was incredibly witty, thought Northanger Abbey was witty, but not in quite the same depth of way, and didn't actually read Austen as an undergraduate, but when I started graduate school, ended up in a seminar, Prose of the Romantic Period. And my professor in that class happened to be an Austen scholar. And so we read some Austen along with some Gothic novels. And during that time, Persuasion was the Austen that was represented. And like Jim, my introduction to Persuasion was the thought, this is not the Austen I remember reading. And it was a much darker piece, even though it was still plenty of comedy. It was a much darker piece to read. Far more uncertainty in this piece as to what was going to happen. To Anne, to Wentworth, to any of the characters, really, beginning with the economic woes of her father. I think when I think about Anne, it's fascinating to see someone who is willing to speak, but throughout this notion of persuasion and listening come hand in hand together. We can only be persuaded if we listen. And Anne was clearly the only member of her family who was not being listened to during much of the first 2/3 of the piece, at least not by her family. Others clearly had a bit more regard for her words, but what we are watching is a character who's defined in what she says and what is ignored. And when we finally get to Lyme and we see the transformation where she is the person who is in charge, even for a few minutes, we see the change in how she is perceived more broadly. Really, my feeling about Persuasion, I wrote a master's thesis on Austen and looking at women, property, and propriety. And my sense of Persuasion is that Austen really wanted to test out a couple of things there. One, thinking about how we might redefine property at a time when clearly more families in England were reaching these kinds of crossroads that the Elliots were. And the other thing, in terms of propriety, something that struck me when I read Persuasion again last week was the idea of Anne's wish that women could have more of a public life, that they simply did not have the ability to really move into the public sphere in a way that was going to be meaningful in the way that the Navy officers and naval men did. And when we look at Persuasion, those characters who are looked upon most fondly are those characters who are actively contributing in public society and not the characters who are living off of their inherited title. And it is most interesting, I think, that one of the characters who has been denied the most in terms of property and wealth, Mrs. Smith, ends up serving as the imperfect but effective sort of catalyst for some of the final plot twists and developments. So think I'll stop there for a second and let's continue the conversation here.
Well, thank you both. If anybody has any questions and wants to put them into the chat, and in the meantime, I know that we have some time for you two to respond to each other's opening remarks. I noticed some themes, but if you have any thoughts as you listen to each other, we can start there. Are you, Jim? I think you might be muted.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
I think we've lost Jim's audio for a minute.
Yeah.
One thing I would say is Persuasion clearly has problems, not problems, but is not the lovely symmetrical structure that Jim was referring to in Pride and Prejudice and most of Austen's other novels. Persuasion really is a novel of three places, of Kellynch and Uppercross, and then of Lyme, and then of Bath. But it is interesting that our movement needs to be away from the tranquility, from the landed gentry, to the place ultimately in Bath where no one knows if you're really landed gentry or not. You're only there by virtue of what you say is your reputation. Mm-hmm. And I found it interesting that in this case, Bath is the place where people are revealed more as Austen intended them to be, particularly Mr. Elliot with his connections to Mrs. Smith and the causes of her poverty. It brings in an element that seems to go well beyond his coming back, reunited with his family simply to regain his place. So I think that go ahead, please.
Yes, I apologize. Oh, Jim? It looks like we might have Jim's audio back.
I think so.
No.
No.
That was odd. Sorry, Jim, you showed up and then so yeah, one thing I noticed, Susan, what you said was something about with the different locations, it kind of tied into that idea of uncertainty that both you and Jim were speaking to as well. It's almost like Bath opens up that uncertainty, for better or for worse, maybe mostly for worse, it seems.
Right.
But I wonder if, you kind of talked about the non-landed gentry, that's where the stability is. So I wonder if there's also for better there with that instability of leaving the landed gentry.
Yeah, I think that Austen's trying to do something new here in moving beyond the idea that the end all and be all is to make sure that everyone has these increasingly perhaps outdated notions of stability. And she's appeared at this time to be moving us toward an idea that we really needed to revise what we were thinking of as a stable, albeit unstable future, in the sense we remember the dialogues where from Mrs. Croft, for example, the hardest thing was being separated and staying at home, not being at sea with her husband, not being deployed with. Mm-hmm. And I think that had Austen had more time to work on this piece, I don't know if we would have seen more in this. I thought at one time that this would be the one of her novels that I would have loved to have seen, whether or not she would return to these characters in 10 years, because this story is not finished, not for any of them, really.
Yeah. And that's actually a really wonderful question that I'd love to hold on to, that idea of revision for when we get Jim back to, because he hinted as well at something to do with the technical changes. I think it would have come up anyway. But, and everyone, as you're watching in, please, if you have any questions, we had a few that were pre-submitted. I'm going to pull those in. And this is actually tying in with one that did come in. Susan, I think that kind of what we're talking about here with that idea of like the landed gentry, and then the what we see like a lot more actual officers, right? Usually naval officers. And one participant wrote in, speaking specifically to one of the adaptations, referencing specifically the Napoleonic Wars on film. And so this individual wanted to know, what can you speak to the larger changes in British society during Austen's lifespan and how we can see those? And I think we can add to that some of those points that we notice in the text, right? Some of those dates that are pointed to very specifically. It begins in 1814. And then there are a lot of other dates in that first chapter. So we can kind of maybe explore some of that cultural context and then get back to the technical questions when we pull Jim back in.
Well, let's see if we have Jim back here. Looks like he is officially muted.
Yes, how about now?
You're back.
Hello.
Okay, good. Thank you. Sorry about that, everyone.
Welcome
Thank you,
back.
Alex, for helping me get back. Okay.
So, Lindsay, do you want to repeat that question and then we can?
Yeah, I was asking a question to follow up on this kind of socio-cultural historical context, since we were talking about the landed gentry, speaking to the situatedness, 1814, when the novel takes place. One of the adaptations really references the Napoleonic Wars. And one of our participants asked if you could speak to the larger changes in British society and how this especially maybe speaks to this feeling like a different novel. And then once we got Jim back, I thought we have some other questions that we left hanging about technical issues in the novel.
Okay. So quickly, I think just to say something about, I think the Navy becomes a big sort of marker of the change, or Austen is interested in what's happening, right, to the landed gentry and so on. And the fact that Wentworth is a naval man, right, is a factor in Lady Russell's initial effort to persuade Anne not to accept the offer of marriage, right? And it's also part of why, Sir Walter is not a fan of the marriage and so on. And yet, at the same time, right, I think there is a kind of recognition that, and by Anne, right, the ethical center of the book, right, that these people do a kind of service for all of us, right, and then that's tied to the way in which Wentworth has his own belief that he was lucky, he'd always be lucky. What's there to worry about? We're going to be great, etc. Right? But that's a very different kind of thing than somebody who's invested, who knows that they have money, right? The income is secure, right? And then at the very end of the novel, it also comes back with in the last paragraph when the narrator tells us about Anne's having to worry about the naval officer when he goes off, right? It's not like Lizzie and Darcy settled at Pemberley, right? There's this other kind of thing. So I don't think it's like revolutionary, or that there's this radical break from or critique of the society, but there is a significant one and a real, I think, acknowledgement of change.
Yeah, it may be not a complete sea change. Sorry, had to put that in there. But there is definitely a sense of anticipation that things aren't perhaps what they had been. I mean, when we look at the 1804, 1805 Trafalgar, things are happening. The Navy is at the center of a lot of British expansion at that point, desires for expansion, still dealing with the aftermath of the American Revolution and the War of 1812 and such are, I think, the tension is in the backdrop to this piece. When are we going back to war? How long are our officers going to be home? I think that certainly is understated but present throughout this piece.
Yeah.
Thank you. One other question that seemed to a thread that ran through your introductory remarks that's also come up in a question has to do with something Jim was speaking to about. Jim, you spoke to the idea that others around Anne have their issues, but I think you said she's kind of set. She's already knows what she needs to do. And we actually have this great question here from someone. Anne is already old enough not to need any moral education, but does she still undergo character change over the course of the novel? And if she doesn't really change, how does she successfully anchor the novel without that character arc? And I thought that was a really interesting point in relation to what we heard from Susan when you talked about the Lyme and the moment at Lyme and her transformation. So kind of thinking through, does she have a transformation? And if so, what is that? And what does that mean for the technical issues in the novel?
Yeah, I'd say two things, right? So there is, I think there's one thread about Anne's feelings, right? So at Uppercross, right, we have this interesting sequence where we first see her playing the piano while Wentworth is flirting with the Musgrove sisters. And there's a little bit of an interaction. And Anne says, thinks to herself, there's something like, his cold politeness is worse than anything, right? So we get that, and that's kind of like the low point, right? And she's I think the narrator tells us that she's playing the piano, everybody else is sort of dancing, and she's crying, right? So we get that. Then we get this, her interactions with Wentworth are really interesting in this sequence, right? So the next big one is when he takes the young Musgrove boy off Anne's back, right? And she doesn't see it, right? But he sees that she's in distress and he does it and he leaves. There's nothing else, right? But she starts to process that. All right, well, how do I think about this, right? And she can't allow herself to think that it means anything other than just this, casual thing, right? But then when they're all out walking, right, Wentworth hands her, and the Crofts come along in their carriage, right? And Wentworth hands her into the carriage. The Crofts say, "Oh, let's give us a ride to someone," right? And there's a long passage in which Anne thinks about the meaning of that, right? He could not forgive her, but he could not be unfeeling, right? And there's this sort of slow progress of her feeling and her sort of opening up to the possibility that something else could happen between the two of them. So I think we are following that. I also think there is a sense in which we could say that, and this gets to the issue of the changed ending, right? That Anne does become a little bit more active on her own behalf, that she does recognize that she can and should express, take some agency for what's happening to her. So the very famous speech at the end about the greater constancy of women, right? She delivers it to Captain Harville, right? But she knows that Wentworth is overhearing it, and that becomes the sort of the final thing for Wentworth, right? That provokes Wentworth to write his letter to her, saying, all right, I've loved you always. There's never been anyone else, etc. And will you have me? Kind of thing. That kind of written proposal, right? So, and I do think that, to go back to the idea of the narrative challenge, if she's not going to change, how is Austen going to tell us the story and make us interested in her, right? And I think it's these two things really. But there's something about that, right? That slow progress in her own feeling, where I was saying in the into opening, right, that Austen is kind of showing us Anne in a particular fate, right? It's almost like we don't have narrative progression. We have more like the revelation of a character in a particular situation. And then with Lyme, it changes and we start to move towards the reunion, right? We can see the steps happening. So that would be, how I'd answer that.
Yeah, I think saying that we're watching a psychological evolution is a little strong, but what we are watching is a character who stays ethically constant, but opens increasingly to the idea that 8 years has changed both of them, perhaps in ways she was not aware of or did not anticipate. I mean, his handing her into the carriage really seemed to be a turning point, in that she is considering what are the implications of that. Why would he do such a thing? And I'll just bring a comparison in with the 2022 adaptation. In that scene where she gets into the carriage, he barely touches her. And there's clearly no thought there, no anything about, well, what just happened. And I think that we see and really reevaluating how she has been persuaded and coming to realize that perhaps she's being persuaded again, except perhaps by herself and by Frederick and not by everything else going on around her.
Thank you. I think we've got a few directions we can take this. And before we shift gears to the adaptations, which we did have a couple of questions about, I wanted to stick with the kind of technique question. We had one here about, can you speak to Austen's use of free and direct discourse in the text and just more generally? One second here. Did she invent that method of narration? And does she use it primarily in certain instances? And what does it add to the text? And I wonder if this can kind of segue us into this idea of adaptations, because we might start thinking about how that may be more challenging to do in an adaptation.
Right. She didn't invent it, but she did develop it, and she made it a kind of dominant mode of narration in a way that I don't think anyone else had done before. And there's a scholar, George Butte, who has looked at Austen's use of free and direct discourse and said that, it's not only that she's using a lot of free and direct discourse, but it's also that she uses it with this kind of deep intersubjectivity. So, and the title of his book is I Know That You Know That I Know, right? So there's a scene in Bath where Anne perceives Wentworth perceiving Elizabeth, right? And so it's like this layering of things, right? So Austen shows us that Anne perceives that Wentworth perceives what Elizabeth is thinking. He's making inferences about Elizabeth, and that's a kind of, I think she deserves a lot of credit for developing that. It also, it seems to me, crucial for everything that I was saying and Susan was saying about this sort of the psychological dimension of the progression. And I think it's crucial for really one of the things that we haven't fully done justice to yet, which is Austen's sort of fine ethical discriminations and doing them sort of through Anne, right? So Anne's relationship to her earlier decision, right, is so layered. And I think that free and direct discourse really works to convey that, right? So that she wanted to say yes, right? She regrets that she didn't say yes. At the same time, she doesn't blame Lady Russell, and she doesn't blame herself, right? She recognizes all the reasons why Lady Russell was persuading her in the way she did, right? And ultimately, she recognizes that she did it because she thought it was going to be better for Wentworth, right? And she's wrong, and she knows she was wrong, right? So, so then we have this narrator sort of going through Anne, right? Forced into prudence at an early age, only to come to romance later, right? A natural result of an unnatural beginning. And the fact that that's sort of shared between Austen's narrator and Anne is just a brilliant use of the free and direct discourse. And then, I think it's also connected to the way in which the Austen handles the reunion, right? So that it is, they talk, the narrator talks about them coming together and what they say to each other and so on, right? But there's this kind of recognition on the narrator's part, and I think to some degree on Anne's and Wentworth's part, that they lost 8 years, right? It's not as if these 8 years were, because it worked out, we're better off for it. No, and this connects to the dark part, the darker, this being a darker novel, as Susan was talking about in the beginning. So I think, Austen gives a lot of credit, not just that because she uses it, but because of how she uses it and how integral it is really to the whole project of the novel.
Yes, when we realize that basically our window into every other character in this novel is through Anne and the narrator, we don't see these conversations. We don't see conversations between Wentworth and Harville. We don't see how others are easily evolving unless they're talking in front of Anne. So we have to have a way to watch watch the evolution of that. And I think I was looking at the questions that are up right now, and there is a question. There are two questions here that I think are interesting. I think one we've been touching on. Isn't Anne's change from one where she is persuaded to one where she isn't persuaded by others? And I think she is persuaded by herself, but she, again, there is a level of nuance in that being persuaded by herself does not mean she turns on Lady Russell at any point. In fact, she defends Lady Russell to Wentworth, even though they're very conscious that this was time lost. And I think that looking at that, and the other character who we haven't really spoken about yet, Mrs. Clay, another question here. Anne and Mrs. Clay seem in contrast throughout. And what about Mrs. Clay being the other woman who exercises agency, albeit of a different sort? But Mrs. Clay certainly exercises her agency throughout this piece. And otherwise, how does she end up going to Bath? How does she end up being, in theory, in the place that Anne should have been the entire time? And I think that we don't get the insight into what she is thinking beyond a certain level of, well, she's clearly making her way and making sure she is staying with this family, whether it's because she wants to marry Sir Walter or whether she's very happy to end up under the protection of Mr. Elliot. But she is more of a free agent than anyone else through much of this.
Right,
piece.
right. But I think, yeah, so just to add to that, right? So it's agency in and of itself is sort of ethically neutral, right? It's how is that agency enacted, right? To what ends does that agency lead, right? And I think in the pick up on the question, there's a contrast between Anne's use of her agency and Mrs. Clay's use of hers, in the sense of Austen's sort of implicit judgments of the two exercises of agency.
Yeah, agency itself is not what Austen is arguing for.
Right.
Agency tempered by
Judgment,
ethics.
good judgment,
ethics, judgment, common sense.
Yeah.
All of the above.
I wonder if that allows us to kind of shift gears and think about these adaptations, if we're thinking Austen's advocating for agency, which does kind of resonate with what we would like today. And so we could start with a general question. What are your thoughts on the various film adaptations? I don't know how many folks in this webinar have seen the 2022 adaptation. One chimed in having seen the 1995 one. The 2022 one that I know you two have watched, there are some pretty strong feelings about it. It's done some significant modernizing. And are there any particular challenges with adapting Persuasion to film? And we have a sub question here that we can get to in a little bit related to adaptation.
I think there are many challenges to adapting Persuasion because so much of this novel is completed, shall we say. So much of the reading experience of this novel cannot be direct dialogue from characters to the audience, for example, which is something that the 2022, and Anne Elliot breaks the fourth wall so often in that, all the way to the final scene, that it is simply, it simply becomes something that is not a darker, more serious novel. I mean, I could say a lot about 2022, but I'll let Jim jump in here.
Yeah, so I mean, Lindsay, like you said, I think the challenge is how do you do something with the free and direct discourse? What's going to be your substitute for that, right? And I think there's a variety of ways to do that, and it really has to do with sort of quality of acting to some degree, right? So that the physical, external behavior can convey something about what's going on inside, right? And I think some actresses and actors are better at that than others. I also think there's we can think about adaptations as having sort of different kinds of relationships to the source text, right? I think the 1995 one is trying to do a kind of understanding adaptation, or what would this look like if we visualized it, right? And then there are some ways in which the affordances of film really can bring out aspects of the novel pretty strongly, right? So the carriage scene, right? You can, and I think in the 1995 version they do that. You could show Wentworth's hand in Anne's, right? And what does that mean, right? And it's just a close-up of that, right? Or the look between sort of the gaze, right? So when William Elliot looks at Anne in Lyme, and Wentworth sees William Elliot looking at Anne, right? Yes. That's visual, right? And film can do that really quite well. But anyway, I think that the 95 one is really trying to capture a lot of the, the effect and the sort of the psychology of the characters and all these kinds of things that we're talking about. And I think it actually does it really quite well. The 2022 one, just quickly, it seems to me that it's trying to keep the plot, keep the setting, and change Anne into a 2022 in Eliot. And for me, that's where it seems to me not to really succeed. Now, I can get the idea that, all right, they're not going for a kind of, understanding in the way that, the 95 one is doing, that maybe they're doing some kind of talking back or some kind of extension of it, or, there's the way Clueless does a kind of transformation, right? So you transform Emma to the 1990s California, right? Okay, modernize it. That works, right? But 2022 Persuasion is like, it's sort of caught between those kinds of things. And then I think the changing of the fundamental change of Anne's character, which is connected to the way in which they have her break the fourth wall all the time, and she makes these snarky comments to the audience and so on. I don't know. It's really interesting, I think, but it didn't work for me.
No, I was thinking when I watched the credits of the 2022 and the comment was based on Jane Austen's Persuasion. That's an accurate comment. Yeah. It is based on it, but while the essential plot is still intact, the changes, particularly to Anne's character, and I would say to Mr. Eliot's character, because with the absence of Mrs. Smith, who is the catalyst for revelations in Bath, there's an entire element of Mr. Eliot's character that is just simply ignored in the 2022. And in fact, he comes off as a rather benign ladies' man of the day, although one can question how quickly or why he thinks Mrs. Clay is an appropriate target in this case. But there are so many things that, leaving out the Mrs. Smith character, and we've talked about the idea that Mrs. Smith is not probably the optimal way of revealing all that needed to be revealed quickly. It's efficient, but it's not elegant.
Right,
by
and
Austen.
technically, it's sort of this rumor and gossip and all that. It's like a little bit beneath Anne and beneath Austen in a way.
Right. It's almost like Austen gave in to Bath and the gossip scene.
Yeah.
In Bath. I don't think this scene would have been written to take place anywhere else but Bath. And it may be more of a reflection on what Austen thought of Bath at that point.
Could be, yeah.
But you know, leaving all of that out does change. So it does change the tenor of the final minutes of 2022, because you simply have the attempt to wrap up in a much more traditional narrative arc where everyone's at Eliot's and Clay's wedding, and Anne and Frederick are happily out in the field looking over the sea. And there is not that foreboding. There is no foreboding at the end of that adaptation.
Right. Yeah. No, that's good. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and they're having fun with the idea of the wedding, right? So we don't know who the bride and groom are initially when we go into the scene. Well, we've seen, Anne and Wentworth get back together. It's going to be them, but no, it's William and Mrs. Clay. Ha ha ha. So
right.
fun with it.
That attempt with the little toy ship they're toying with us there before we're allowed in to see who's really being married. So it's, I mean, there are a lot of instances in that adaptation where if we can go for the clever, snarky line, we go for the clever, snarky line throughout.
Right.
Which might have been more fitting for earlier Austen, but not for this.
Right. Or if you go all the way to 2022, right? And just like they did with Emma, right?
Right. Yes, if you transplant everything, instead of talking about a playlist with a pile of sheet music that Frederick left her.
Right.
Yeah, when you hear that, you think something's going to happen here that's not quite in sync.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we could have a full hour just on Jane Austen adaptations of a single novel, I'm sure. And we've got about 5 minutes left. I've got a couple of questions we were not able to get to, but one that I think maybe we can do quickly and then wrap up with some closing remarks.
Sure.
And it's kind of in line with this idea of the adaptations and how we tackle this with narration. So if you want to add anything more. In the novel, we have the narrator and Anne's perspective. In the adaptations, the Crofts become the audience, and I might not be familiar with this one adaptation. Is this intentional and in some ways become an instrument of the narration? What are the effects of how the different adaptations have done this? That's actually resonating for me with Jim, you mentioned how Austen revised the novel, and originally the Crofts were involved in making this confrontation happen, but that's a separate point. I cannot think of the actual scene though that is speaking to. But that would make sense that in an
Mhm.
adaptation, you would need to do that, have a character be, the audience and stand in for a character stand in for our understanding and knowledge of things. So if there are any other thoughts on that, or if we want to wrap up with our kind of final thoughts on larger questions, right? What is it about persuasion that endures? We started with why it's distinctive. We spent some time thinking about how much Anne changes, and that really kind of came back. I had a question we didn't get to, which was like, what is one of the main themes? And is it that a woman should submit or not? Was she right to be persuaded? Was she not? That really seems to be the core of things. And how does that endure if today we wouldn't tell someone to be persuaded? Obviously, in this 2022 adaptation, we wouldn't like that. So yeah, what is it about it that makes us continue to read and watch it?
Well, I'll start there. I think that persuasion in this particular instance, I think persuasion in modes of communication we have seen throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. Ultimately, a question most of us keep asking ourselves is who's persuading whom and to what end? So I think that the notion of how are we individually persuaded? How are we collectively persuaded? For me, going back to this novel, I'd probably go back to this novel, and it is the one of Austen's I've gone back to the most often just to read because I'm not a 19th century scholar. I think it is the idea of how do you deal with this notion of social forces, family forces? How do you deal with that? And I think that does bring us back to that. How does loss, how does time, how do those things come into play? And how are we perhaps persuading others? So I would go back to just that idea as to why this novel you can go back to and continue to consider. So.
Yeah, I would second what Susan's saying, and just maybe add a little thing, right? That one of the things about the going back to Anne's agency, right? So we think about persuasion, we think about Anne being persuaded, but there's another way in which Anne persuades Wentworth, right? By being herself, right? Being true to who she is, and so on. So the question of who's persuading whom and for what ends, has multiple. You can say the who and the whom. You can have multiple answers to that, and that works too. I think for me, there are two big things. One is the way in which I think of it in relationship to Austen's career, right? This being the final novel and it being different, and the way in which it then sheds light on what she did before, and opens up this possibility of, well, had she lived, what more would she have done? Is this a kind of change? And then I think the novel itself, right? And this sort of grappling with loss and recovery, this sort of the again, I go back to the sort of the ethical discrimination that's throughout in Anne, through the free and direct discourse, and so much else, right? Even Wentworth, right? That there's this great scene. This is another sort of free and direct discourse scene when in the upper course section, when we get this thing about the large fat sighings of Mrs. Musgrove when she's thinking about Dickie, right? And Dickie is been kind of this worthless guy, right? And Anne and Wentworth exchange a look, right? Even as Wentworth is consoling Mrs. Musgrove, there's this kind of, shared understanding, right? So there's also this amazing kind of, perception and possibility and communion, but that's in the midst of all this other kind of stuff. And it's just so rich, I think, the novel itself, right? And then there's also, I think, so the sexiest line in all of Jane Austen, which is when Wentworth asks Anne after the engagement, right? If I had come back, right, several years ago, right, 2 or 3 years after we had this thing, and had reapproached you then, would you have responded positively? And Anne just says, would I? Right? And it's sort of the desire and the implication is it's just like, oh yes. And so there's something about that, Austen giving Anne those 2 words, that exclamation point, and then I'm supplying the tone and all this other stuff. But I think that's really great. And it's another sort of feature of Austen that comes out in this novel in this sort of, maybe subtextual way, but I think it's there.
Well, thank you. I mean, what a great tone to end on, and also just thinking about how relevant it is today, like you talking about loss and melancholy. And we have another comment here. It says, setting it all up so that it comes down to a letter from a reader and a writer. Of course, that's going to resonate for us. So thank you both. A big virtual round of applause to Jim and Susan for sharing your time and expertise with us today. And thank you so much to everyone who was able to join us this afternoon. We appreciate your time and your thoughtful questions. Please keep an eye on your email and the English department website for information on future book club meetings. And we will also send out a recording in the next couple of weeks of this event. Thank you for being here, and we will see you soon. Have a great one.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Lindsay.
Thank you all.